As Holden followed Leya back into the vice president's residence, only one thought was repeating through his skull. Get away. He needed a break. He needed to put distance between himself and his protectee. She was driving him batty in more than one way. She'd ignored his texts. She'd left without him. She'd almost kissed him, and he wasn't sure which of those things pissed him off more. What was worse, what had him screaming silently to himself, was the fact he hadn't pulled away immediately. The look in her eyes as she leaned forward, the way the natural honeysuckle essence of her had washed over him, making him hungry for everything she'd offered, had bent the last straw of his reserve. His control was fading. He snapped himself back to the house as they approached, scanning the porch, the door, and the hedges. No movement at all. Emptiness. Her hips swayed as she mounted the steps, and his assessment fell apart. Never had he wanted to strip someone bare the way he craved doing with Leya Singh. It frustrated him and drove him right up to the edge every single day. He should have walked away from her 2 years ago when the first hint of desire had slammed into him as soon as he'd walked into the recording studio in Grand Orchard. Instead of turning tail, he'd seen it as just another challenge. Admitting an attraction to his protectee on his second protective assignment would have derailed his career in a heartbeat. His boss would never have trusted him again. Rather than admit defeat, he'd simply added, "Don't look at Leya's mouth and don't stare at her hips," to the mental task list he kept in his head. It was a mix of daily to-dos as well as short and long-term goals he'd kept running for as long as he could remember. He'd already checked off thousands to be here. One of the most coveted assignments in the Secret Service. Protecting the president, vice president, and their families was why people joined. And if they told you otherwise, they were lying. This was the job, the suit, the earpiece. You putting your life between the enemy and the leaders of the free world. Leya reached for the handle of the back door, and he stepped in after her, casting a wide glance over the entrance, the stairs, and the hall. He didn't have to do any of it, as there were cameras all over the place watching 24/7. But the continual assessment was a built-in habit after 2 years of being the only Secret Service agent on her detail. She had a private security team, one he respected, even though there'd been plenty of reasons not to, but it was never the same as Holden checking the boxes himself. When Leya had insisted on having only one agent with her, the Secret Service had balked, but she'd held firm. He never minded being a lone wolf, even preferred having the control all in his pocket. Preferred it so much that when Leya came back to D.C. and he had to revert into being a pack animal, the one who wasn't in charge, his mind and body rebelled at the idea. As soon as they'd arrived in D.C. after Fia's wedding in Boston, his boss had called him and said, "Take some time off." Most people wouldn't have balked when the special agent in charge of the Vice Presidential Protective Division gave them a command, but Holden had insisted he didn't need a vacation. He'd told himself it was because he didn't want to look weak, but really, the weakness was in staying. He couldn't stomach the thought of another agent watching over her, staring at the full lower lip hovering over a delightful cleft, or watching the way her hair danced around sharp cheekbones when she talked, or being mesmerized by the way her long fingers played with the rows of leather and silver bracelets dangling up and down her wrists. He didn't want another agent getting the text that begged for them to show up. Jesus, he really needed to get a grip. He watched her almost dance the way up the stairs, feet light and graceful. Her entire body would be tucked up against Lincoln Matherton's tonight. He'd be the one surrounded by her sweet, floral scent. And even though Holden knew her well enough to know she wasn't interested in Lincoln the way half the planet seemed to be, it would still be a challenge to stay focused. Instead of having his eyes on the room, the people, the movement of the crowd, they'd be drawn to her hips slammed against another man's. As her lead agent, he was usually with her when she went out, regardless of the time of day. When he was the only USSS agent on tour with her, he didn't have a choice. But today, he did. Technically, his shift ended in 30 minutes, and he was suddenly, desperately in need of the space his boss had offered. He needed to get his priorities in check, his dick in check, his head back on straight. "You'll have someone else with you tonight," he called after her. She turned at the landing, and brown eyes ringed in deep, lush lashes looked back at him with a dash of sorrow and regret filling them. "I figured." He frowned. She'd known he'd leave her? Why did that stab at him? "Well, now you know for sure." The snip erupted from him before he could stop it. Her eyes flared with a hint of the anger he was stupid enough to like seeing. It happened so little. Normally, she was even-tempered, like the rest of her family, calm in the face of the storms during the election as well as the attacks on her bandmates. But he'd been the one to see her break in her private moments. Not another agent. Not even her friends. "You don't owe me an explanation, Special Agent Kent. Any body will do, right?" It was the formal use of his name instead of Holden or Captain Annoying as much as her arched brow and the emphasis on the word body that had him wanting to take the stairs 2 at a time and remove the look with his mouth pressed against hers.